Welcome to Unscripted, a podcast with no script by design. We're not following a plan, and that's exactly the point. This show is about whatever's on the minds of your hosts, Larry, Lannan, and Duncan Giles. We'll dig into what's happening in the world, and just as importantly, what isn't making headlines this week. So with that, let's get started. The conversation could go anywhere because we go wherever the microphones take us. Here's Larry Lannan and Duncan Giles. I'm Lannan, he's Giles, and this is Lannan and Giles Unscripted. We welcome you to our podcast. Today is our July 25th edition, and welcome Duncan Giles.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here.
Well, we are in the Midwest, entire Midwest. We are, of course, in central Indiana where we record this program, but we have something hovering over this whole part of the United States called a heat dome. And I'll tell you something, this is no small thing. Heat can kill. So anybody who might be watching or listening who's in this heat area right now, and I would suggest, follow the advice of the local officials, hydrate yourself, take breaks if you have to be outside. It's not a small thing.
No, and that's what my background today is, what it feels like outside, except with the lovely humidity that we have as well. That, basically just, okay, taking breaths, no, that's not an option for today.
In case you need to know when you're listening, Duncan does have a desert background with mountains in the back. I kind of like that background, but it's fun. So yes, be careful. And it's a dry. They used to talk at Las Vegas. I saw a comic in Las Vegas once, and it was in the middle of summer, and it was 105 degrees. He got up and said, they always say it's a dry heat out here, but so is a blowtorch.
Yeah, I was going to say so's an oven. Exactly, same thing.
So I'll say one thing: if you're in the desert, like southern Arizona or Las Vegas, in the summertime, like in August, I was out in Phoenix in August years ago. I literally walked across a parking lot and nearly burned my feet. I mean, that's how hot it just bakes.
I would believe it.
In that sun, in the desert particularly. He and I will have two stories each on something that did not get a lot of attention in the news business. Then we will talk about our main issue, which is the separation of church and state, and how that has emerged from our early constitutional days to the best we know it today, and it's still a bit unsettled. I'm also going to talk about a Critic's Corner item. He and I both have one of those. And I will end the podcast with my top 5 list, but I will start the podcast with my first news story that didn't make the headlines. This is an issue that happened in a suburb of Miami, because this is a really heroic thing to talk about, but it also kind of gives us another big story people need to know about in this suburban area of Miami, Florida, because there were some people who were just having a quiet evening, having dinner, no problem. All of a sudden, an airplane going into a small airport, a general aviation plane, actually lands into a tree, inside or up on a tree, if you will. So all these people had to come out, rescue the folks in this airplane, took some risks themselves to do it. And the mayor of this town, which is called Pembroke Pines, his name was Angelo Castillo, said it was nothing short of heroic the way this went. So first of all, hats off to these people in this suburban Miami area. They stepped right. You could just stand there and wait, for the first responders. No, they jumped right in and rescued these people. And there's no guarantee they would have survived had they waited for the officials to show up. But the mayor of this town, Castillo, was very frustrated because in the past 5 years, in this little general aviation airport outside of Miami, they have had 30 plane crashes. And this is a very heavily populated area. And there actually was one street they named after a 4-year-old boy who died when a plane crashed into their SUV. They're driving along a street in an SUV and a plane crashes into them, killing this poor 4-year-old boy. So basically, this mayor said, and I quote him, "We need better assurances that these planes are not going to keep falling out of the sky." The airport was a dairy farm before World War II. Now it's the busiest general aviation airport in Florida. But within a 5-mile radius, there are about 500,000 people. So heroic story, but the mayor of that city says, "Help! Somebody help me."
Yeah, if there have been 30 crashes over the past 5 years, there is definitely something wrong with the airport. Too short of runways, too close to general population. Obviously, if somebody's crashed into an SUV, whatever the situation is, it needs to be corrected or it needs to be closed because, with right now with a shortage of folks in the FAA and things of that nature, it's not going to get any better. So hopefully they can figure out a solution to that.
And Duncan, your first story.
Yeah, my first story is something that we're starting to see across the country. This happened, I believe, in Boston. I'm not sure if I remember that correctly, but a judge had to dismiss over 100 cases because there were no public defenders. And across the country, basically what the problem is these public defenders are so low paid, they've said, we cannot take any more cases. Nobody is coming to work for us for public defender, legal aid, whatever it is in a particular city or state or county. So they're getting overwhelmed by these case numbers and they can't deal with it. And so this judge said, hey, I've got no choice, but I've got to dismiss all these cases because these people, according to the Constitution, are entitled to due process and counsel if they cannot afford one. And basically the public defenders are saying, we can't do it. And this is starting to be widespread across the country. You're seeing more and more of this being an issue. As tax bases get smaller, everybody always wants to cut taxes. We want to cut taxes. Well, this is one of the effects of that type of thing where, you don't have money to pay these people. You don't have enough staff to do it. And you and I are both familiar with not having enough staff to do the job that we need to do. And so, it starts to break down our criminal justice system. And this is something that absolutely has to be corrected. They need to take looks at this, figure out a solution nationwide. This is not just a Boston issue or a Northeast issue. This is a nationwide issue.
Yes, I can tell you that having covered courts in my career years ago, it was a crisis, but nothing like this. I mean, I've never seen a case dismissed, a criminal case dismissed because there was no public defender to be found. Public defenders don't make a lot of money, and some of these attorneys coming out of law school have gigantic, loans
Right.
they're trying to pay off. And that wasn't as true then years ago as it is today. So most of them end up moving on to a prosecutor's office sometimes, or they don't make a ton of money, but they make more than
Right.
the public defenders in most places, or going into private practice where they can make some money and start paying their loans off. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, but we do have to find solutions because the Supreme Court is very clear that the expectation is you will have representation in a criminal case. If you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. Let me move on to my final story that didn't make the news. And we're going to go international on this one. This is from New Delhi, India. And police in India have arrested a man accused of running a bogus embassy from a rented residential building near the capital, New Delhi, and recovered cars with fake diplomatic license plates. Now, this suspect impersonated an ambassador, allegedly duped people for money by promising overseas employment, took money from them for employment he didn't have. That's according to the police officials in that area of India. And according to the police, this man, who's 47 years old, I won't even try to pronounce his name, claimed to have acted as an advisor or ambassador to places such as Saborga and West Arctica. Those were the nations he represented. just so you know. And they just found all these doctored photographs. It's a strange story, Duncan. That's all I can tell you. And the guy is facing all sorts of charges, illegal money laundering through shell companies, again, internationally, doing it with entities abroad, forgery, impersonation, possessing fake documents. So this man is going to face the music. But he convinced people, Duncan, he was a diplomat representing a country that does not exist. I'm trying to figure out how you can convince somebody that what is it called? West Arctica actually exists.
Yeah, that's at least maybe in his mind, he was sitting there going, okay, if I do this but don't have an actual country, then maybe I'm okay. But I'm not going to say something that could get me copyright infringement like Fredonia or Westeros. I don't want to get in trouble that way. But yeah, some people will come up with the most interesting scams possible, and because there are so many people desperate for help, desperate to find greener pastures, be it in their country or out of their country. Unfortunately, this does not surprise me, but it is a little bit of a unique take. And now he's headed to be an ambassador to Three Hots and a Cot type thing, I believe, now for quite a while.
Don't think I'm going to spend my time in an Indian prison, but he apparently is headed that way. If he is convicted, again, they have kind of the same legal system we have based on the British. So, it's an assumption of innocence to proven guilty. Duncan, I think you have a second story.
Yep, I sure do. And this one basically AI is the big thing, artificial intelligence. Everybody wants to jump on the artificial intelligence bandwagon. How can we use artificial intelligence? How can it help us? How can it make our business more productive? And the administration has jumped on this full bore to try and help out companies doing AI. Well, to do AI, you have to create what are called data centers. Basically, to store stuff. Stuff doesn't go in a cloud; it actually goes in machines. And these data centers that are popping up across the country more and more take absolutely tremendous amounts of power to keep them up and running and being cooled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And people say, oh, it's great to have these data centers. They'll create jobs. No, they don't. Once the construction is done, very few jobs are created. Your electricity costs will go up because they need to figure out where to get more electricity. And now they're talking about doing smaller nuclear plants around several of these to basically try and create more power to power these things. So there's never going to be something for nothing. So, there's always going to be a cost to something. And the cost for AI are these data centers, which, take a lot of electricity, and most of the electricity comes from coal, and so that's going to pollute the environment even more, greenhouse gases, things of that nature. So it's a vicious cycle. So there needs to be something, hopefully they can come through with some sort of breakthrough to try and reduce the amount of electricity that these centers need.
Duncan, it's interesting because I have a friend of mine who writes nationally about technology issues, has for years. And early on, when you were if you're in a community and you wanted to attract a high-tech business, you would need to have a data center nearby. And most of them at that time were in California. That's why a lot of the tech companies started in places like California, Seattle, where they have data centers nearby. Well, now once high-speed connections became a possibility, then that wasn't necessarily the case. Well, now you mentioned this AI the growth of that has now caused a growth in this whole data center thing. And here's the real issue, Duncan, I think. Should you raise the electricity rates of a retired lady who's 80 some years old because the community wants a data center? And really, the data center, yeah, I mean, you'll get construction jobs when it's constructed, but it's very well documented. The data center itself is not going to create many jobs at all.
Right. Exactly.
It's not going to necessarily create high-tech businesses like it used to in the old days because you got high-tech, uh, high-speed connections where you can connect to a data center far away from where you are, so you don't have to have that data center right next door or nearby. So I think the real issue is the one you mentioned. Should people be penalized with their electric rates going up? And they almost always will,
Yep,
and it will be a,
absolutely.
and it will be a huge drain on the infrastructure of that community. Where we live in Indiana, there are some communities trying to attract these data centers, and it's been controversial. So we'll have to see how that ends up. Thanks for that. Let's going to move on to our main issue. Our main issue today deals with the separation of church and state. It's an issue that has confounded America from the very beginning because this is the thing I find interesting. This phrase or principle, the separation of church and state, is really nowhere in American law or the Constitution. It's really been the judicial interpretation of what the First Amendment says. And here's what the First Amendment says about this, and I quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the exact language in the United States Constitution. So there are two elements in that part of the Constitution. There's the Establishment Clause, which restricts the government endorsing or supporting any kind of religion. This really goes back to the founding father, people who founded this country, who came from parts of Europe where the religions and the governments were one and the same. I mean, they were wedded together. Government and religion were the same, and they saw that the problem with that. And they wanted to get away from that when we started our own nation, our own democratic republic. So the Establishment Clause comes from that concept. And the second element in that constitutional amendment I mentioned, the Free Exercise Clause protects individual religious expression. You can see how these kind of tear apart and come together. It's caused friction. Now, this whole phrase, separation of church and state, that did not originate, again, in the Constitution or even in a court decision originally. It first was written by Thomas Jefferson
Yep.
in 1802 in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association.
Right.
And his exact quote was, he saw a, quote, wall of separation between church and state, unquote. That's where this separation of church and state, the wall, that's where that whole concept comes from. But that phrase has guided the courts. The courts paid attention to that letter, which, even though it was a letter from a president to a church, it has influenced the Supreme Court and other judges as time went by. Now, we have to remember something, and this is something people forget when they look at the history of this. In the early days of our democratic republic here in the United States, there were states within the United States that established churches, religions, and even religious tests for public office. States and local governments in the early part of the United States would have a religious test if you wanted a public job in both a state or a local governmental position. Well, over time, the states did start moving away from that, moving away from this whole official religion idea at the state level. And by the mid 1800s, most state constitutions included some form of religious neutrality. So there was a slow but sure move away from that. So, Duncan, I think a lot of people forget that history. You know, it took us a while to really believe church and state should be totally separated everywhere from top to bottom.
Yeah, it's one of those things that when you talk about the founding fathers, Jefferson, again, in that letter that you mentioned from 1802, and James Madison were both big into saying, you know, the church should be talking about religious matters, but it should not be involved in governmental matters or looking at who should be, you know, backing people, things of that nature. And it took decades, as you said, for some of these early states to get away from the religious aspect of it. And you have to remember, take a look at the, Puritans who landed in 1620, Plymouth Rock, so the story goes. Were trying to escape religious persecution in Europe so they could practice the religion that they want. And that's been a bedrock, no pun intended, for the United States throughout its history is, welcoming all religions. Some are more accepting than others for various reasons. But yeah, that's been the bedrock, and to keep that away from, it shouldn't have anything to do with candidates or how you govern.
And Duncan, I think it's important to remember one aspect of the founding fathers. Most of them were Christian, but they were not adamant Christians. Some went to church, some didn't. They weren't. They were not avid Christians, I guess is the way I put it. And some of them weren't Christian at all. Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He believed in a God, but was the interesting thing. And if you read a biography of Thomas Jefferson, something interesting he did. Now he did believe that the teachings of Jesus Christ were worth looking at and had value, but he was turned off by the miracles in the New Testament. So I don't think a lot of people realize this. Thomas Jefferson put together his own version of the New Testament. He literally got a copy of the New Testament, got a pair of scissors, and put his own version of the New Testament together, at least the four Gospels, and took out all of the miracles, but kept the teachings of Jesus in his own little version of the Bible. So I thought, when it comes to Thomas Jefferson, the man was full of complications and I just he was not always consistent in what he believed that all men are created equal and own slaves. So that's the kind of person Jefferson was. He was a complicated man. When I talked about the states, often having religious tests, moving away from that. That really began in the 14th Amendment in the post-Civil War area of the United States, but then it took the Supreme Court all the way to 1947 in a case called Everson versus the Board of Education, where the Supreme Court clearly said the Establishment Clause applies to state and local governments, and they did use the term wall of separation, the same one that Jefferson used. Now, there are a couple of different areas where I think, and we could talk about a lot of different things. There are two areas where the courts have dived in and where there has been conflict over the separation of church and state. The first one I want to talk about is the posting of the Ten Commandments in public buildings. I'm going to go back to 1980. We go back really far, but I'm going to start with 1980 in the Supreme Court, a case called Stone versus Graham. This was in Kentucky. Now, in Kentucky, they passed a law requiring the posting of the Ten Commandments in all public school classrooms. And the Supreme Court said, no, this violates the Establishment Clause, and that display had no secular legislative purpose. Due to that, they said, okay, Kentucky, you can't do it. Fast forward to 2005, it's McCurry County versus ACLU. Once again, it's Kentucky. Kentucky counties were barred from posting the Ten Commandments in their courthouses because it was to advance religion. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Also in 2005, the Supreme Court had another Ten Commandments case, Van Orden versus Perry. This was in Texas. There was a Ten Commandments monument on the state capitol grounds. Supreme Court said that was okay because it was not just standalone, it was part of a broader historical display and did not endorse a specific religious message. So we're starting to get, where you kind of have to separate this from that. So these decisions, I think, are going to highlight what a lot of legal experts have called the contextual nature of the Establishment Clause and the Supreme Court rulings. They're going to look at the intent, the setting, and the presentation before they determine any constitutionality.
Yeah, and it goes back to also many things like Christmas displays, nativity scenes, where people want them on public grounds for city or state, things of that nature, where groups like the ACLU said, hey, look, if you want to do this, you have to include all religions, not just the Christian religion here, because of the fact that, again, the separation of the church and the state comes into play. So it's really, back in the 40s and late 40s, early 50s into the 60s, it was basically, hey, look, we need to make sure that this is kept separate. Basically, just like the wall separation. When we talk about Jefferson and Madison, when we talk about the founding fathers, it's always goes, to me, it always goes back to what was the intent of what was said, especially in different amendments to the Constitution. That's where it always becomes tricky, and we're not even going to get into the Second Amendment, because those interpretations are all over the board. But how much separation should there be in the interpretation? And I think Jefferson's letter was great in guiding that. But like I said, Madison had the same views too, as well, to keep the church out of government and politics.
Well, as I said, there, like you mentioned, Christmas decoration, that kind of thing. There are more than, but I'm going to limit it to just two sets of cases. First was the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about this issue of prayer and religion in public schools. That, I think, is the other big area where the courts have tested this whole issue of separation of church and state. I'm going to start with 1962 with Supreme Court decisions. It was called Engel versus Vitale. It struck down the official school prayer in public schools. This is the Supreme Court decision that creates such a ruckus all across America, because what it basically said is that no official school prayer should be done in public schools, even if it's non-denominational and even if it's voluntary. Because what the court basically said is you can say it's voluntary, but you're a child, you're in a school,
Yeah.
and everybody around you is praying. I mean, what are you supposed to do? You want to stand out? So they basically said you can say it's voluntary, but in fact, it really is not voluntary when it becomes a group activity like that. So Engel versus Vitale, and I remember, I was old enough to remember the tumult that happened when that came down. People just kind of lost their minds over that case, but that's what it said. Then we go back to the next year, another case, Abington School District versus Shemp. This had to deal with Bible readings and recitations of the Lord's Prayer in public schools. That was also ruled unconstitutional for a lot of the same reasons. Now let's fast forward to 1985. The next case we want to talk about is Wallace versus Jaffrey. Now this is a law that was passed allowing a moment of silence for meditation or voluntary prayer. That was struck down because, again, it lacked a secular purpose. Going back to an old ruling, no secular purpose could be gleaned from that. So as a result of that, that was struck down. You can't have this moment of silence. Then in 1992, another case, Lee versus Wiseman. In that case, the court ruled clergy-led a prayer at a public school graduation ceremony unconstitutional. So you can see where the court was going there. If there was some secular reason, fine, but if not, keep religion and any kind of religious, specific religion, out of the schools. Now, in the year 2000, there was a case called Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe. This is a case where there was a student-led prayer at football games over the school's public address system. That was deemed coercive and unconstitutional for a lot of the reasons that I mentioned before. Now, I'm not going to cite cases on this, but ACLU and other groups have said clearly, a clearly student-led activity is fine. It's when the adults get involved or whether it's coercive by a group of students. If it's a group of students who want to have a student-led prayer activity, I mean, the courts have not had a problem with this. It's just where it looks to be a group activity or the adults are leading the way, either officially or unofficially. That's where it's the coercive effect that the courts have looked at. And is this a captive audience? Now, if you look at the courts, they have what they call the Lemon test, which came from a 1971 decision, Lemon versus Kurtzman. When they look at these actions, there were three elements that the courts would look at to run this test of whether or not this is something that should happen. Number one, is the action, does it have a secular purpose? Secondly, is the primary effect to advance or inhibit religion? And thirdly, it must not result in excessive government entanglement with religion. So those are three elements the courts were looking at in that Lemon test. And they have some other tests, the endorsement test, the coercion test, historical practices, all the courts trying their best to be the referee between people who say we need this in the schools or we don't need this in the schools. Now, I do want to say one thing. It looks like the Supreme Court may be moving in another direction. We don't know that for sure. But there was a 2022 decision, Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. In this case, it was a high school football coach. He was disciplined for praying on the field. And what the court said there is, well, okay, we're going to side with the football coach here. Because they felt this was a protection of his individual religious expression, even if he's a public employee in a very visible role such as that. So when you see that decision, you go back to that Lemon test and you're thinking, well, maybe the court as it stands now may be moving away from the Lemon test. Not totally, but at least to some extent. And your thoughts on this whole issue with prayer in the schools and just religious activity in public schools?
Yeah, and you've seen how it's changed from like the court case in the early 60s, 62 up to 2000. And then you're starting to see more and more lower courts. Certainly the Supreme Court didn't really weigh in for quite a while, but lower courts were giving more leniency towards religious activities in the schools. And it's really been sort of a fascinating thing to watch because, as you said, there was a clear delineation between student-led things where they didn't have adult advisors, consultants. It wasn't formed by the adults. It was strictly, a natural thing done by students versus adult-led. And now we're starting to see that pendulum swing way over to basically saying, okay, we're going to allow the football coach to do the prayer on the field, and are the students that are the players that are students that don't partake, are they going to be ostracized for not doing it? It's almost like they're coerced into doing it, whether they want to or not. And then again, when you talk about the prayer, are we talking about strictly, Christian prayers? Okay, what about folks who, what about Jewish? What about Islam? What about, there are so many different Hindu. What about, all these different things that are basically not being allowed, only Christian in these schools. So that's where it gets to be a point too. Are they going to allow every religion to basically do their own prayers?
Duncan, we have in the city of Indianapolis, there was a situation where we had a group that opened up a church. They called it the Church of Satan. And I think the only reason they did that was to test this whole religious liberty thing. I'm not sure these people were Satanists. Maybe they were. But I think that was just their way of testing, okay, if we call ourselves a religion, are you going to protect us? So I think the bottom line here is that our Constitution and our history, we are very much a society that wants to protect religious liberty, whatever your religion may be. But I think the government also has tried to stay away from endorsing religion or coercing people in any kind of religious activity. I think that we want individual expression allowed, government neutrality where it can be done. But as you can see, that tension is always there. And sometimes you have to split some hairs to figure out what may and may not be allowed. And I have only one last comment about this. Probably one of the finest authors the city of Indianapolis ever produced was Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut wrote a book called A Man Without a Country. I'm going to quote you a quote from that book. For some reason, the most vocal Christians among us never mention the Beatitudes, part of the Gospel of Matthew. But often with tears in their eyes, they demand that the Ten Commandments be posted in public buildings. And of course, that's Moses, not Jesus. I haven't heard one of them demand that the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, be posted anywhere. Blessed are the merciful in a courtroom. Blessed are the peacemakers in the Pentagon. Give me a break. So that's my final comment. Any final comment from you?
The pendulum has swung so far on this recently. The Internal Revenue Service, which has said for decades that you can promote voting, things of that nature, or particular ideals, but you cannot back a candidate or a political party, has earlier this month said, oh yeah, you can do that now. We can, because both parties have definitely skirted with this with churches. But now they basically said, yeah, sure, go ahead. Back a candidate, back a party. You can keep your tax exempt status. And to me, this is going against what the founding fathers like Jefferson and Madison had said and trying to keep that separate. Now we're talking about totally meshing it together, which is not, to me, what the First Amendment says.
That's very well said, Duncan. Of course, I think the conservative groups have been pushing for a change in that IRS policy for years.
Yep.
But what they don't think about is the fact that liberal churches as well as conservative churches can do this now. So it does cut both ways. So I don't know how that will, help or hurt anybody in the end, but whether it's a positive thing, I'm not so sure about. Let's move on to our Critics Corner, and I'll start our Critics Corner today. My Critics Corner item I'm going to review is a Netflix documentary. Now, I was born in 1951, so I was the first television generation. TV had been invented a long time ago, but World War II stymied that technology from growing and going into homes because the war effort. It was really about 1947 that industry began to ramp up. And by 1951, more and more people had televisions in their homes. And as far back as I can remember, we had a television in our living room. In fact, one funny story I like to tell people, I was a preschooler and my mom would take me to the grocery store and I would go buy the cereal boxes and I would point to the cereal box and tell my mother what that cereal was. And the people in the grocery store thought, my goodness, you must have some genius child here, can read at the age of 3. Of course, again, TV was new. They didn't realize it was Madison Avenue that had done that. I knew the pictures from the commercials on TV. I knew the pictures of those cereals, so I knew what they were. So my mother just smiled and knew that, of course, her son was not a genius, but I knew all the cereal boxes. So that television began to change us in many different ways. One thing that happened early on, one man that was very part of television for its very beginning is a man named Ed Sullivan. He really did invent the TV variety show, which lasted well into the 70s and 80s before it sort of died away. But it was one of the staples on network TV, and he invented that whole idea. So for many people, the Ed Sullivan Show, on Sunday nights, my mom and dad, that's all we had. I don't care what else was on TV. We always watched the Ed Sullivan Show. And they had the great variety of acts. If you didn't like the act that was on, just wait a few minutes. Something you like will be on next. So for many people in America, he was best known for bringing some of these popular acts that didn't have a wide audience. Elvis Presley was the first example. He put Elvis Presley on TV at a time when he was kind of a niche teen thing and got the exposure he needed to move on. And of course, the Beatles, who could forget that? He really made the Beatles a national phenomenon by putting them on his variety show. But Ed Sullivan did something else very important. And this is what this documentary film on Netflix is called, Sunday Best, The Untold Story of Ed Sullivan. And the untold story is dirty little secret of television in the 50s and early 60s. I'm old enough to remember this. Duncan, I'm sure, remembers at least some of it. But on network TV, really in local TV, most parts of the country, you never saw an African American on TV. Amos and Andy, maybe that's a whole other thing. I mean, but as far as any kind of actual presence of African Americans on TV, you just never saw them. They just weren't there. Well, Ed Sullivan changed all that. And the network, the sponsor, and in those early days, one company usually sponsored the show. And Lincoln Mercury sponsored his program well into the 60s before that kind of came out of favor. And they pressured him not to do this. The network pressured him, and the affiliates in the South were very upset about this. They never took his show off because it was a variety show. It had all kinds of different things. But he was the first TV show to feature black artists on a regular basis. One of the great stories is about Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte was basically blackballed from TV, blacklisted, if you will, and he had pretty far left ideas, particularly for the 50s and early 60s. And Sullivan at first was fine with not having him on the show. He was very popular. The guy was a great singer. He had hit records, but Sullivan said no. But Belafonte went and met with him and tried to reason with him and explain to him why he felt the way he did and why he should be on the program. Well, Belafonte walked away from that meeting thinking he didn't get anywhere. As soon as he got back to his office, his agent called him and said, well, Sullivan's show just called. You're on the show now. He had convinced Sullivan to put him on. And Sullivan, really had to do battle with the sponsor, the networks, and again, particularly the affiliates in the South, but even elsewhere, because Belafonte was a controversial guy. But Sullivan made it a personal point of his that, he wanted Belafonte on the program. So Ed Sullivan did some very risky things. He very easily could have been shunted aside, but the network never took him off the air, and he always knew that was a possibility. He made his living early on. People don't know this. It's in the documentary. He was a sports writer when he started in journalism. Then all of a sudden, the newspaper that he worked for in New York put him on the Broadway beat. He knew nothing about Broadway. He knew nothing about show business, but he did what every journalist does when you get a new beat. You learn, and he learned quickly and became the most respected columnist in New York City on the entertainment scene. And that's really the way he was able to get the acts that he needed to run the show. And, it was a live show in the early days. It remained a live show, even when live shows were rare on TV. And he had all kinds of situations where he would run short and try to figure out how to lengthen an act or he would be short on time and try to hurry people off.
Stretch it.
It was like, so these were the things that TV didn't deal with much, except in the early days. He continued to keep the show live because he thought that was the best way to do the show. I give this a B+. A great, great documentary film. It's on Netflix. It's called Sunday Best, The Untold Story of Ed Sullivan. Any thoughts, Duncan?
Yeah, I have to check that one out. And people, it's a really big fruit or not. Really big fruit. For those that don't know, that is a obscure Ed Sullivan impression. But yeah, before TV got so segmented, and people today don't realize that, this was a huge event. Sunday nights were huge events because you wanted to see who Ed Sullivan was going to bring on now. Was it going to be the guy spinning plates? Was it going to be the Dancing Bears? Was it going to be the Beatles? You just never knew, and it was such a wide variety. But yeah, I do give him credit for being one of those that said, yes, I'm going to bring on African-American acts. I'm going to do that. And there are, entertainers like the Beatles and Frank Sinatra who said, if you're going to segregate my audience, we're not going to play your places. So people like Sullivan who would do that on a scale of a huge national stage on his television show, I absolutely give them kudos for doing that, because it was absolutely necessary and needed and a great thing.
Yeah, and I think they do in the documentary talk about the fact that, he was not charismatic or TV friendly.
No,
and
he was not.
He was. In fact, there are executives at the network that wanted to take him off early on, and they stuck with him. And glad they did in the end. But there were people who made fun of him all the time, and he kind of dealt with it in a kind of a fanciful way. But anyway, I'd like to hear your Critics Corner.
Well, this being Shark Week on Discovery, and that's a huge deal anymore. I remember when it first started, it was nothing that big, and now everybody wants to jump on Shark Week. Well, my beautiful and awesome wife Kim, is repulsed but fascinated by sharks. Last year was the first time she had been in the ocean, and she was scared to death that Jaws made a huge impression on her as a young child, and so she's always worried about, she's going to get eaten by Jaws when she's in the ocean. But yet she loves watching these type shows. So yes, last night we watched a show on the Discovery Channel called Surviving Jaws. And basically this was talking about the things that, that came from Jaws. How were they in real life? Were they a myth or were they real? And I'm sitting there going, well, I don't think Jaws meant to be a documentary, but okay, let's go ahead and watch this. And the first thing that they did was they talked about, okay, you had the first two people that were eaten by Jaws were a skinny dipping woman and a young child on a blue, I don't remember whether it was little boat or raft or something of that nature. So their basic imitation of that was, okay, let's put somebody in a naked bodysuit, a diver in a naked bodysuit, stick them in a cage with a plexiglass front, and somebody in a all yellow suit, stick them in a plexiglass cage, and let's see which one the sharks pay attention to. Which I thought was a really interesting non-scientific experiment, but okay. And it turns out that sharks don't really see flesh color as a color because of the background and the way that their vision works. So the lesson I learned there was, don't wear yellow or white if you're swimming in shark-infested waters. Why you're swimming in shark-infested waters, I don't know, but that's beside the point. Then the other two things that they came up with were, one of the myths is, how do you stop a shark attack? Well, you punch it in the nose. So they came up with this contraption. I swear it was like something from a Saturday morning cartoon where it had the old springs where you'd have a boxing glove on there and it would punch somebody. Same type of thing, but they did it with more pressure and underwater and trying to get the shark close to the cage, where they hole in the cage like that, where the diver could, try and hit him in the nose. That proved to be tremendously ineffective. I actually think it gave the diver a concussion. You couldn't tell because he was weird enough anyway, but that's, again, neither here nor there. So then they decided to let's try electricity. Now, I'm sitting there going, and they mentioned this on the show, it's sort of like, you don't want water in a toaster. Yeah, how are you going to do this with electricity? So they're taking some sort of homemade electromagnetic pulse device, EMP, and trying to point it at the sharks. Well, if the shark gets right up to you and you shoot the EMP on them, because of the way the sharks work basically in hunting, that screws them up. They go away. So, and there were some other things on there, but those were the two main takeaways. So basically the lesson is, if you're going to go shark hunting, apparently take an EMP weapon with you that has to be constantly recharged. If you're going to be swimming, take an EMP weapon with you that has to be constantly charged. That only works for about 5 seconds. Otherwise it's going to melt. And then, you'll be able to keep the sharks away. So I would, this Discovery Channel on Jaws, I would have to give a miss for it. It was just, it was rather silly. It didn't really add much value to it.
Well, I got a couple of comments. Number one, you mentioned that lady who was eaten by the shark in the very first scene of Jaws.
Yep.
Her name was Susan Bacalini, and the only reason I know that's because I had a chance to interview her, and she tried to use that, I guess, fame that she gained from that film being so fabulously popular. She and her boyfriend were able to get a film financed, and they produced this film called Day of the Animals. So she wanted to come on a radio show and promote it, so I put her on the show, talked to her. And of course, Day of the Animals was an absolutely awful film, so it pretty much ended her film career. But she and her boyfriend, I don't know what they did after that. But she talked about what it was like to be on the set, and she talked to Roy Scheider and some of the people. I mean, she was not in the same scenes with them, but she kind of ran across some of them. But yeah, and the one thing about the Jaws film is it tried to give the shark some kind of revenge instinct,
Yeah.
which shark does not have. Okay, that's I guess Peter Benchley had to put that in there for the story, but it probably wasn't. But hey, it was a great film. What can you say? And it's a miracle the thing ever got done, and we could talk about that in itself. Okay, Duncan, are you ready for my top 5 list for this podcast?
I am.
I mentioned I was a radio. I interviewed people on radio. I had several talk shows I hosted on radio. But the one that probably got the most attention was a show called Night Action. And it wasn't started by me. It was started by a man named Gary Lee, who was later known as a reporter covering auto racing for the most part. But Gary started this at a suburban radio station. It's now WZPL. It was called WSMJ in those years at 99.5 on the FM dial. He started the show, and then a fellow named Art, what was his last name? Anyway, a fellow named Art from Boston, Massachusetts, had the show for a couple of years, and he moved on. And I ended up working at that station because I was going to college at the time, and it was close to where I lived. And the fellow they got in to replace Art fell out of favor with the management. You know how that goes. So the general manager pulled me into his office and said, well, we're going to either do one of two things. We're either going to just cancel the show or we're going to give it to you. Which would you want? I said, well, I guess I'll take it. So I did this late night show for a couple of years, from about 1975, starting then. And remember, this was a late night show. This started at 11 p.m., went to like 3 or 4 a.m. It did, 3 a.m. for a while, 4 a.m. at different times. It started at 11 p.m. almost the entire time. So my job was to be controversial. And I had a lot of interesting guests. So I'm going to give you the top 5 guests that I had on that Night Action program that I hosted for 2 years in the mid 70s. Number 5, I can't even remember this man's name, but it was a man that not only argued that there are aliens existing on Earth, the UFOs have brought them down and they are living here, but they have taken on a human form and they are living amongst us. So, Duncan,
Yeah, so that eventually became a film, I think.
Well, yes, more than one. Of course, Duncan, now we all have to ask each other, okay, are you an alien?
Well, I've been accused of being very strange and not from this planet, but I don't believe I'm an alien.
Okay, so we got that on the record now. He is not an alien. I don't think I am either. Okay, number 4. Here's the one thing that's the staple of late night talk shows. Psychics. Oh my gosh, I had lots of psychics on. And they were quite popular amongst the audience and regularly wrong about their predictions. So they would make predictions and they were almost always wrong, but they were fun. And people would like to call in and ask the psychic to tell them what's going to happen in their future as if the psychic actually knew. Number 3, and this guest kind of goes into his own category. I got this letter from this group, and they were led by a man who called himself the Sababu. That's right, the Sababu. And they said he was all these different things. He was this religious leader. He was a psychic. He could heal people, da, 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 da. So, okay, it sounds bogus to me, but hey, it's a late night show. Let's bring the guy on. So he comes on. He walks into the studio about 15 minutes late and with a turban and a white tunic, and he's holding his, in a prayerful type of thing, just kind of bows his head and he goes, I am the Sababu. Welcome, Sababu. Have a seat, Let's talk. He claimed that he could heal people talking to them on the phone. So I would watch this man talk to someone calling in on this talk show. He would look down and he would start shaking uncontrollably, saying that he is sending energy through the telephone line to the person on the other end, healing whatever, ails them. and that was supposed to take care of it. The problem was about 45
The
minutes
late
out.
60s and early 70s were fun.
Yeah, well, mid 70s here, but we're pretty close. And then about 45 minutes later, the first person who was supposedly healed called and goes, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sababu, it didn't work." And, he said, "Well, it doesn't work right away." Kind of had to dance around that a little bit. But that was Sababu. It's hard to forget that guy. He was just different. Number two, I don't know if you remember this man. I had on a guest named Bernie Herman. Bernie Herman was a personality in Indianapolis television, late 50s and part of the 60s. He had his own talk show for a while. He hosted a movie show. Most of the local stations had movie shows around 4 or 5 o'clock, right before the local news would come on. And so Bernie Herman hosted that. And Bernie Herman had a radio talk show in the evening. It was on the old WFBM, which had radio and TV at that time, and was, I think, the first TV station in Indianapolis to go on the air. They were the very first one, radio and TV, to go on the air commercially. So Bernie Herman was well known. He then moved on to Philadelphia to at a bigger market and so forth. But we had a mutual friend. I didn't know him well, but I was able to get in contact with him and brought him back. And it was a very popular show. People really liked hearing from him. One thing I remember is I had a teacher in high school who, before she started teaching high school, was a reference librarian at the Central Library in downtown Indianapolis, and said every day she saw Bernie Herman come into the library because he wanted to prepare for that movie show to find out everything he could find out about that film that was on and all the stars of the film so he could tell stories about them. So the man knew how to do his research. You always had to give him credit for that. So that was a popular show. A lot of people talked about that. You probably don't remember this guy, do you?
No, that was, to use the phrase, before my time.
Yeah, so that was kind of a popular one. Here's the number one guest I had on my radio talk show, and I've got to put some context into this so people understand. Yes, in the mid 70s, I did have David Letterman on my radio talk show. Now, to put that into context, David Letterman and I were doing radio talk shows at the same time. He had an AM station, I had an FM station. I was late at night, he was on during the day. We never met each other, or even talked to each other on the phone before he left for California. But we had a lot of mutual friends. So once he left, I was able to cash in on some of those friendships. And at that time, he was not on a TV star at all at that time. In fact, to give you context on that, he was working the Comedy Store at that time, trying to make a name for himself. A lot of people who became very big and famous comics later were in that Comedy Store group that he was with. Bill Maher. There were a whole bunch of other people who were comics who became big stars after they were in the Comedy Store. But you may remember a TV show called Good Times, and there was a character called, was it JJ, I think it was? And the man who played that role was Jimmy Walker. Jimmy Walker was a stand-up comic before he got that role on that TV series. Well, and it was a very successful series, but even the most successful series only goes so long. And once that series was over, Walker decided to go back to the circuit and do his stand-up comedy again. Well, he got up on a stage for the first time after the show was over, and Duncan, I guess Jimmy Walker bombed. I guess and that is a humiliating thing for any stand-up comic. So he fired his writers and he hired David Letterman to write for him. And I guess that turned things around for him. So when I interviewed Letterman, he was writing comedy for Jimmy Walker and doing the Comedy Store before he was famous. But one thing I do remember, when I got him on the phone, of course, we talked for a few minutes before we went on the air because it was on a telephone interview. And we were just having a regular conversation like two people would have because even though we never met each other, we had a lot of mutual friends. We were kind of talking about how they were doing, what was going on in Indianapolis at that time. Even though he left, he, still had some interest in what was happening. But again, just a regular conversation, really nice guy, just regular talk. Once I put him on the air, remember this was the mid 70s. I put him on the air, introduced him. He goes, "Well, Larry, I'm sorry. We're going to have to cut this short tonight because I found out that we've got a really big moment here. The Waltons are picking berries, and I don't want to miss that." So he started the show. So he just became that smart aleck that on TV. Once he was on, he was in a public eye. He was one person. If you meet him personally, he's just a completely different person, just a very regular guy from Indianapolis you would ever expect to see. But that public David Letterman, that smart aleck comedian, immediately clicks on once he's in a public setting. I thought that was great. And he still is one of the great comedians on TV of all time. So I've got to say those are my top 5, Duncan. I don't know how you...
Very nice.
You liked
Very
it.
nice.
I'm glad it met with your approval. And we hope that our podcast today has met with your approval. We very much appreciate the fact that you have watched, and we hope you spread the word. Let other people know if you like this podcast. I'm Lannan, he's Giles, and this is Unscripted. We have one ask for you as the audience. Like and subscribe to this podcast. We appreciate it. Duncan and Larry will be back soon with another episode. In the meantime, this is Unscripted.